Well, I think we're going to get started because we have a lot to cover today. So thank you all for joining us today as we begin our 5-part Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence Botulism webinar series. My name is Ingrid Hewitson, and I'm the interim co-director of the Colorado Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence, or the COE. We're one of 5 COEs across the country with the mission of providing peer assistance and training to support state and local health departments to build their capacity to track and investigate enteric diseases. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for this first session, which is focused on foodborne botulism. Our first speaker, Nicole Comstock, is the Communicable Disease Deputy Branch Chief at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Nicole received a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Health from Colorado State University in 1997 and a Master's of Science degree in Public Health from the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in 2009. She began working as an epidemiologist with CDPHE in 2002 and has worked on communicable disease surveillance and outbreak investigation and has responded to a variety of public health infectious diseases involving Colorado. Robin Trujillo, our second speaker, is the Enteric Disease Unit Manager within the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's Communicable Disease Branch. Robin earned her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of Colorado in 2005, and she's currently enrolled in a Master of Science in Nursing Leadership and Administration in Nursing and Healthcare Systems program with the University of Colorado Denver College of Nursing. She started her career in a hospital inpatient setting and spent time as a care team nurse in an FQHC. She spent over 6 years as the director for Baca County Public Health Agency in Southeast Colorado before moving to El Paso County, where she worked in TB, immunizations, and then managed family planning for 2.5 years. Our third speaker is Dr. Marisa Bunning, an associate professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition and an extension specialist in food safety at Colorado State University. Dr. Bunning earned her BS in botany from Cameron University, her MS in plant physiology from Oklahoma State University, and her PhD in food science and safety from CSU. Her research focuses on food safety communication, post-harvest produce safety and quality, food processing, and consumer food handling behavior. As we go through the presentations, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A section and we'll try and answer them at the end. Now I'd like to hand it over to Nicole Comstock to start us off.
Thanks, Ingrid, and thanks for inviting me to speak on botulism in Colorado and public health response. Robin will be sharing our slides here. And we'll get started. Next slide, Robin. So botulism is a rare but serious illness caused by a toxin that attacks the body's nerves. There's around 200 cases of botulism reported each year in the US. In Colorado, we see on average about 3 cases per year. The development of antitoxin to treat botulism as well as modern medical care means that people who have botulism have a much lower chance of dying than in the past. Before antitoxin, mortality reached around 50%, but since antitoxin has been available, mortality is at 5% or less. But even with antitoxin and intensive medical and nursing care, some people with botulism will die from respiratory failure. Others die from infections or other problems caused by being paralyzed for weeks or months. And recovery from botulism can take months, and patients can have long-lasting health effects. Next slide. So before we dive into our response here in Colorado and what the epidemiology of botulism looks like in our state, I just want to refer to the botulism case definitions. If you're not familiar with case definitions, it's a set of criteria used by public health for disease surveillance. It allows public health officials to classify and count cases consistently across jurisdictions. These case definitions are not intended to be used for clinical diagnosis or by healthcare providers for decision making. It's really just a public health tool. Botulism is reportable in Colorado by healthcare providers and laboratories. It's also reportable at the federal level. This means that providers diagnosing patients with botulism, as well as laboratories that might do any testing for botulism, must notify public health if they suspect botulism in a clinical setting. This presentation today will be focused on foodborne botulism, but there are other forms of botulism, including infant botulism, wound botulism, and other forms of botulism. The case definitions are listed here, and this is what we use again in Colorado to classify our cases. I will mention for under the other category, there is iatrogenic botulism, which is botulism associated with exposure to high concentrations of botulism toxin administered for cosmetic or therapeutic reasons. For the past 21 years, our cases of botulism reported in Colorado are demonstrated on this slide. Infant botulism cases are noted in blue, foodborne in red, and wound botulism in green. As I mentioned, we average about 3 cases per year in Colorado over this 21-year period. In Colorado, our population is 5.75 million, with most of the population located along the I-25 corridor, which goes through Fort Collins, the Denver Boulder area, down through Colorado Springs and Pueblo. So most of our cases, as you'll see in a future slide, occur in our more populated areas. The public health system in Colorado is decentralized. We have 53 local public health agencies who typically take the lead in investigating most communicable diseases. Botulism cases in Colorado are often co-investigated with the state health department and local public health agencies involved. You can see that infant botulism cases account for the majority of our botulism cases reported in Colorado, followed by foodborne, and lastly by wound botulism. Although in the last 2 years, we have seen an increase in the number of foodborne botulism cases reported and investigated in our state. The case counts displayed here do include suspect cases that didn't necessarily meet the case definition, but cases we invested time in investigating that had no clear etiology or other alternate diagnosis, but were not laboratory confirmed as botulism. Next slide. Over this 21-year period in Colorado, you can see the demographic of our botulism cases broken down here. Again, infant cases were the highest majority of cases that we see here in Colorado, followed by foodborne and then wound. Of note, our foodborne cases are where we have seen deaths, 3 deaths. All of those deaths occurred in people over the age of 60. And in all 3 categories of botulism, there is more males than females affected. Our wound botulism cases, we've only had 5, have mostly been associated with intravenous drug use, including injecting black tar heroin. And we had 1 case caused by trauma from a dirt bike accident. So our cases of botulism over this 21-year period in Colorado, again, have occurred primarily, really statewide, but most cases have occurred in our more populated areas, as demonstrated in the darker shades of red on this map. Next slide. So let me walk you through how the bacteria Clostridium botulinum causes human illness. The bacteria itself is ubiquitous in soil, meaning that it is found really anywhere in the environment. Foods grown in soil are often implicated in foodborne botulism cases, such as potatoes. CBOT is a gram-positive spore-forming rod bacterium that grows best in an anaerobic environment at around a pH of 5, and when it's growing, produces a neurotoxin. There are 7 types of toxin that can be produced, and they're named by the letter A through G. Type A, B, and E, and rarely F can cause human disease. Type A typically has the most severe symptoms. Type B usually causes milder disease, and type E is usually associated with foods of aquatic origin. This bacteria can make spores, which act like protective coatings that allow the bacteria to survive in all types of environment. It's a very hardy bacteria, and when in spore form, it can survive heating, boiling, and freezing. Ingesting the spores themselves generally do not cause people to get sick, but under certain conditions, including when the spores are in an anaerobic environment and have an environment where there's low acidity, an environment where there's low sugar and salt content, and in temperatures between 37 and 99 degrees Fahrenheit, the spores can germinate. And as they germinate and start to grow, they start to produce the neurotoxin. Certain foods are considered especially risky, including home canned foods and fermented foods. Low acid foods that have a pH greater than 4.6 are often implicated. When the toxin is ingested, The toxin blocks acetylcholine neurotransmitter release, which then prevents muscle stimulation. The initial signs of botulism typically always follow this pattern where people have trouble seeing, trouble focusing, they might have trouble vision or feeling of drooping eyelids. In fact, we've investigated several cases here where they first seek care at their eye doctor because they're having trouble seeing. Symptoms then progress within hours or a day or two to other symptoms in the head, including facial drooping, slurred speech, difficulty swallowing. There's generally a pattern of descending symmetrical paralysis. So it starts in the head, moves down, and eventually you can have paralysis of the respiratory system and cardiac failure, which can result in death if not treated. The symptoms are similar regardless of the exposure route. So whether you're investigating a foodborne case or a wound case of botulism or an iatrogenic case of botulism, the symptoms are typically the same. Symptoms can be a little bit different in cases of infant botulism, but given that infants just don't have the same physiologic features as adults. Diagnosis is typically through neurological examination and a high clinical suspicion. But diagnosis is often challenging as patients may not be able to provide an exposure history because they're unable to talk. Often they're intubated soon after seeking medical care. Botulism itself is fairly rare. Not a lot of healthcare providers have seen it, and symptoms can mimic other neurological conditions. Delayed and misdiagnoses do occur, and laboratory confirmation can take days. So administration of antitoxin should not be delayed, and you should not wait until we have lab results if a case is highly suspected. Next slide. Prompt public health response to reported cases of botulism is really important, especially foodborne botulism. Public health role is to arrange for consultation with CDC, antitoxin distribution, and human and food specimen collection and testing if warranted. Public health generally has a role of collecting leftover foods for possible testing if a case of foodborne botulism is suspected. Public health also needs to determine if other people may be at risk, either from consuming the risky food or from a commercial food that could be widely distributed. Public health also has a role in determining if other people who might have been exposed to the implicated food may be symptomatic and not yet recognized as a possible case. And public health should be linking those patients to care and talking to healthcare providers to have that patient assessed. And then this would be extremely rare, but botulism toxin is considered a bioterrorism agent. So another role of public health is to investigate cases, determine what might be the cause of the symptoms, and especially if there's a situation where there are multiple cases with no known connection between cases, treating that as a possible intentional release of toxin and then looping in law enforcement as needed. Next slide. So there will be a series in this education series, or a presentation in this education series down the road that will focus specifically on testing. But just want to mention here that most testing is done at CDC, or some state public health labs or local public health labs may have the ability to do testing. Here in Colorado, we send all of our botulism testing to the CDC. In all types of botulism, whether it's food, infant, wound, or some other form, serum is recommended to be collected and is, in our case, generally tested at CDC. Stool is recommended to be collected from patients who are thought to have foodborne or infant botulism. Wound swabs can be collected in suspected cases of wound botulism, and food can be tested as well. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Robin to talk about an outbreak of foodborne botulism that was investigated here in Colorado last fall.
Thanks, Nicole. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to just walk you through an outbreak of foodborne botulism that happened in El Paso County, Colorado, in the city of Colorado Springs in October of 2020. So on October 27th, case number 1 and his ex-wife consumed a hone canned item. The ex-wife also used the juice from the jar to cook in her eggs. On the next morning, which would have been October 28th, the case presented to the hospital in respiratory distress. There, he tested positive for COVID, and he was immediately intubated and admitted into the ICU. On the same day, his sister was arriving from Arizona to visit, and on that day, she also consumed a home canned item, and she commented to the rest of the family that it was not good and needed to be disposed of. On the morning of the 29th, which was the day after, the sister presented to the same hospital in respiratory distress. She was immediately intubated and admitted into the ICU, and her COVID testing was negative. It was on November 1st, these cases were determined to be siblings who had presented with similar symptoms, and the hospital did a little more investigation to determine that they had shared a food item per the family. So at this time, they notified CDPHE, and we initiated the investigation. And sadly, on December 14th, the initial case did pass away and succumb to his illness. Of note, again, case number 1 was positive for COVID, and his initial symptoms of respiratory distress were attributed to the COVID diagnosis until that connection was made to the sibling and shared food items. So there was potential delay in this case in the botulism diagnosis related to that COVID diagnosis. So we had a conference call, the CDC, the care providers taking care of the patient at the hospital, CDPHE, and El Paso County Public Health all discussed these cases via conference call. Due to the clinical presentation, the similarity of symptoms in patients who were siblings with a report of a common food item, it was determined that there was high suspicion for foodborne botulism, and CDC then approved testing and release of human botulism antitoxin. So the human botulism antitoxin is distributed by CDC staff in Colorado with oversight by the LAX quarantine station and support by Colorado Public Health. So upon CDC approval, the antitoxin was immediately couriered to the Colorado Springs Hospital, and in this case was administered within 6 hours of notification to CDPHE. The stool and serum specimens were collected on both cases prior to the administration of the antitoxin and was sent to CDC for testing. So on November 1st, we did begin the case investigation using the California Case Investigation Form. In this investigation, we worked hand in hand with El Paso County Public Health, who is the local public health agency, that were gracious enough to provide us with a Spanish-speaking epidemiologist to complete the in-home investigation, even though they were overwhelmed with COVID at the time. As Nicole mentioned, in most cases, the LPHAs do their own investigation, and due to the COVID response, CDPHE was responding to most incidents on behalf of the LPHAs, and in this case, we were able to work hand in hand with the LPHA. In the home, we did find a home canned green chili canned by a family member who was the ex-wife. She explained to us that the way these jars were canned was that they heated the contents that they were intending to put in the jars. They did water bath the empty jars and then placed the contents into the jars. They sealed the jars and then flipped the jars over on their lids. The family member stated that they had been canning like this for years. Basically, she said her entire life. So in this case, we did take all of the jars that were available out of the home. 3 of those jars were sent to CDC for testing. We had 1 empty jar that was consumed by case number 1, 1 partially consumed jar, and 1 full but unsealed jar. The remaining 10 jars were destroyed by CDPHE lab after we received the testing results. Interestingly, the case's son had eaten one of the jars soon after the canning and did not become ill. They told us that he had eaten that jar around probably a month after the jars had been canned. And also the case's ex-wife had used the juice from that jar to cook in her eggs that day and did not become ill. And the case's ex-wife was given precautions, including signs and symptoms of botulism, and to seek care immediately if she experienced any symptoms. So with the green chilies and botulism, we know that green chilies are grown in soil, and we know that botulism spores live in the soil and can be present on foods grown in the soil. In this case, we had a low oxygen and a low acid environment in the sealed jars. The jars contained green chilies, tomato, onion, carrot, garlic, olive oil, and vinegar. In this case, we suspect that the vinegar likely did not produce the level of acidity needed to prevent toxin production. And also we know that the home canning process did not follow proper canning procedures necessary to ensure food safety. So both of these cases tested positive for botulism toxin type A at the CDC laboratory. The female samples, her stool and serum were both positive, and in the male, the stool was negative and the serum was positive. They also experienced a hard time in getting stool from the male who was experiencing some constipation. So that's just an interesting thing to note. And then the green chilies that we did send to the CDC lab also tested positive for botulism toxin type A. So in this case, we determined there to be no ongoing risk to the public since we had a home canned product that was removed from the family home. And also in this outbreak, it was just believed to be a tragic outcome of the accidental mishandling of the home canning process. We reached out to Colorado State University, or CSU, the Extension Office for translation of canning resources into Spanish for the family member, as well as an offer to provide virtual one-on-one PowerPoint presentation for the family member. And unfortunately, in this case, the family member who had canned the food item was quite traumatized by the outcome of the home canning process and did not desire to continue to can food, and therefore declined our offer of education. And so that concludes our overview of foodborne botulism and the outbreak in El Paso County, Colorado. And so on this slide, we do just have a few resources, including the CDC botulism webpage, the infant botulism webpage. There's a video that CDC put out earlier this year for the administration of botulism antitoxin that could be very helpful to clinicians. And then we also have the recent MMWRs on botulism, which include the clinical guidelines for diagnosis and treatment of botulism that were put out in May of 2021, and also the botulism type B after intravenous methamphetamine use from October of 2020. And just of note that before the publication of these, the clinical guidelines for diagnosis and treatment of botulism, no comprehensive clinical care guidelines existed for treating botulism. These evidence-based guidelines provide healthcare providers with recommended best practices for diagnosing, monitoring, and treating single cases of outbreaks of foodborne, wound, or inhalation botulism, and were developed after a multi-year process involving several systematic reviews and expert input. And then we are going to take questions, but we're going to wait until after Dr. Bunning does her presentation. So if you can hold questions till the end, we would greatly appreciate it. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Bunning.
Thanks, Robin. And good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here with you today. This is an important topic, and glad to see so many people joining in today. And the like you see on the first slide, I'm an extension specialist, which means that I answer all kinds of questions, but quite a few questions about canning. And Extension, which is affiliated with land-grant universities across the United States, it's the same case, that Extension is a go-to resource for home food preservation, including canning. And so I'm going to be giving you just an overview of some of the issues and what leads to some of the problems that can eventually cause a case of botulism. And so in doing that, I'm going to be focusing on the risk and what goes wrong. But I want to first acknowledge the popularity and the benefits of home canning, since most of the focus will be kind of on the other side. But for home canning, it is quite popular. It's a hard thing to estimate. We don't know exactly how much food is canned at home, but judging from the number of supplies that are sold, it's a pretty high amount. And people choose to can at home for many reasons. Sometimes it's a family tradition, but it can also be because you can have some control over the freshness of and even specific information about the variety of the tomatoes and the quality. And then it's a rewarding experience to be able to preserve some of your own food for the winter months. And then because the jars are recyclable, you can also cut down on waste. So there are a number of factors. I just want to mention that right off. There we go. But like I said, we're going to focus more on the hazards and the risks. And CDC tracks botulism cases, and because it is such a severe illness, and they report that home canned vegetables are the most common cause of botulism outbreaks in the United States. And you may have heard throughout last year that there was a surge in home gardening, and that in turn led to an increase in home food preservation, including canning. And because of that, there was a shortage of the proper equipment, jars, the word fittings, which refers to this two-piece lid that is required for home canning, and then for other supplies. So this is and if you're not familiar with canning, every single step and all the equipment are very critical. You can't vary from the process, or you may end up with an unsafe product. For example, the two-piece lid here consists of a screw band and the lid, the ring, which has a sealant on it. It cannot be reused, and those were definitely in short supply last year. So, but if you're new to canning, you might not realize that. You might, and it's not always easy to tell if a lid has been used in the past. So that this is one of the issues and why we see some problems with canning sometimes. So in order to learn more about botulism cases, we can turn to CDC because they do surveillance, and then they provide some of that information, so it's available for us. And in looking back through what has been reported for the almost last 20 years, you see over and over again a wide variety of home canned foods, different types, not just one certain type of home canned food. And I'm also pointing out that they often refer to the type, and in many cases it's type A. We'll come back to that. You may remember that in 2015 there was a very large botulism outbreak that occurred because of home canned potatoes, a total of 27 cases, which is in botulism history, that's really high. And that had to do with the fact that the potatoes were processed in a boiling water canner, which we're going to cover that information, that the improper equipment was used. And sharing home canned food in a group situation is also not a good idea. So a couple of things went wrong in that incident. And in looking through peer-reviewed articles that report back about outbreaks, and also with CDC surveillance, these are some of the low acid vegetables that have been associated with outbreaks in the past. And I'm emphasizing low acid right there because that's the dividing factor on how foods are processed at home for canning. Because if they're acidic, if they have a lower pH, then they can be canned using a boiling water canner, which is more readily available. But if they are neutral in pH or low acid foods, then they have to be pressure canned. So that's really where, in many cases, what has gone wrong is that the wrong type of equipment was used for the particular food that someone was trying to can. And since we're talking about boiling water and pressure, we have to bring in elevation, because elevation impacts those things. So we happen to live in Colorado at higher elevation. So we are well aware of the fact that because we are higher, we have a lighter blanket of air, in other words, less air pressure on us, and that changes our boiling point. Just down the hall, this water was boiling at 204, and that's as high as it'll ever get. So it's different than if you were at sea level. And as you can see from the chart over here, boiling point is a vertical moving target. The higher you go, the lower that boiling point. And we know that well in Colorado. This is kind of a landscape view here, really just to illustrate that elevation varies widely, even within a county, even within a community. And our average elevation is the highest in the US, So so our population is aware of this, but they don't always translate that to information that they need when they're home canning, but they should. And we're not the only ones with higher elevation. As you look at this topographical map, you see that quite a large region of the country reaches those higher elevations, and it tends to be divided by 3,000 feet, but actually adjustments have to be made at even lower elevations than that when it comes to canning. So as you can see, quite a few states reach those higher elevations. And another thing I wanted to point out has to do with the type A, because we do have a harsher environment, higher elevation, different environmental factors in the West. And in some of the journal articles about botulism, it's reported that type A is more frequently found in the Western US, and type B is more frequently found in the Eastern US. And CDC tells us that type A tends to be more common with many of the home canned foods. Not the only one, of course. But. So because of those changes in elevation and pressure, we have to make adjustments. And this is probably the most critical part for canning that is often overlooked. So in a boiling water bath or boiling water canner, you have to add time. You have to cook it for a longer period of time than if you were doing it at sea level. And you can do that method with the acidic foods like jams, pickles, or salsa. But if you are pressure canning, you have to add pressure. And most of us are used to using boiling point, thermal processing in the kitchen because we follow those instructions. Bring water to a boil for 8 minutes. We're familiar with that. But if you're going to pressure can, you have to become familiar with this process also. And with pressure canning, it's essential to reach 240 degrees. And that is important because of botulism. So inside that canning jar, you have all the conditions that are favorable for botulism spores. You've got that anaerobic environment. During the process, oxygen is expelled from the jar as part of the process, but so making it in an anaerobic environment, which is suitable for botulism. It's also, if we're canning low acid vegetables under pressure, it's a low acidic pH as well. So this temperature is the critical factor here. This is our defense against botulism spores. So if it isn't done properly, if the recipe isn't adjusted, if the pressure canner isn't used, then you can't reach the 240 degrees, which would make it a safe product. So I've kind of covered some of the science behind it. So what's needed for safe home canning? We recommend that home canners think like food processors instead of home cooks. You have to think like a retailer, and like if you were making a commercial product. And you have to have the right equipment and the right supplies, and you have to follow the right method. Every time you open a can of tomato soup, it looks the same because the same process has been followed, and you can count on that soup, commercially canned soup being safe. And a home canner has to think like that. They have to have the standard jars because it's tempered glass. It can withstand the pressure and the heat. You need those types of jars. You also need the proper two-piece lid system with new lids, and you must use the right equipment, whether you're pressure canning or boiling water canning. And if it's a pressure canner, another thing that new home preservers might not know is that you need to have that tested yearly. Also something it's frequently done at extension offices. So just like calibrating it to make sure that it's reading accurately. And then you need to have a tested recipe. A recipe that's been tested means that inside the jar there are thermocouples that were placed there for whatever food was being tested, because there's different consistencies and thicknesses. We call it the food matrix. So it has to be able to reach the proper temperature and at the very center of that jar, and then you also have to follow all the procedures. You need to allow enough headspace, not too much headspace, to be able to make sure that a seal can form. You also have to cool the jars properly after you take them out of the canner. The cooktop type might not always work well. If you have a flat cooktop, may not get up to high enough heat to be able to can. So you have to think about even your kitchen equipment. And then labeling, another thing that may be overlooked with home canning, is you need to label when that food was canned and what the food is and how it was canned. So you have some way of knowing, so you can remember later. So there are a few peer-reviewed journal articles that review some of the outbreaks that have happened associated with home canning. And I took these 3 quotes from this article by Date et al. Based on 3 outbreaks a few years ago. And these are examples of the same things that we hear in phone calls, that recipes are often passed down in families or given from a friend. And this talks about an old cookbook, but new cookbooks can have recipes that for home canning that aren't tested and that don't have any information about elevation. It may be someone who wrote a cookbook and they live at sea level. They may not even be aware that they needed to mention that someone at higher elevations need to adjust those recipes. And then one of the things that often happens is not having the right type of equipment, the pressure. And this says, I'm quoting because it says pressure cooker, it should be pressure canner, but didn't have that, so changed to used a water bath instead, which wasn't adequate. And then in this case, they shortened the cooking time, which is another thing you shouldn't do. So Robin outlined what we call open kettle. That's when you fill the jars, but the filled jars are never processed. And even though you heat the contents and the jars, that's not adequate. So that is something that's unfortunately still commonly done. But you find all kinds of methods like canning in a dishwasher, in a microwave, in an oven, but these don't reach the proper temperatures. The conductivity is not adequate, and we don't know the times. No tested recipes, just all kinds of reasons for those types of methods being unsafe. There are electric multi-cookers now that have canning listed, but there aren't safe recipes for doing that. And research has shown from Utah that temperatures are not consistent at higher elevations with some of the multi-cookers. So that we don't recommend that multi-cookers be used for canning. And another, I mentioned pressure cookers are not the same as a pressure canner, and tested recipes must be used. And then using the wrong kind of canner or switching to a different kind of lid if you're not using the standard 2-piece lid could be a problem, or even doing, making homemade preserves, but just putting melted paraffin on top. So those are all things that can lead to problems. Just really briefly going to mention that to help share this information a little more readily, because that's really the difference. Some of the home canners that don't have the right information don't realize how critical it is. That's often where the problems occur. So we have a cell phone app or interactive website called Preserve Smart, and it emphasizes elevation. You can see it's already set on this screen. So as you add the app to your phone, it asks what your elevation is, or it helps you find your elevation, so you can enter that information. Then when you choose a vegetable, say green beans, and you look up information, we put in right up front, as you can see, use a pressure canner. So we think that's information that's really going to be helpful. So it's obvious that's the equipment that you need to have to do this safely. Then I'm going to go into the next screen here, and I put in 5,000 feet, so you can see that that's highlighted for me. So that tells me that if I have a dial gauge pressure canner and I'm going to do pints, that I need 13 pounds of pressure, or it can vary depending if you want to do a larger size or if you're going to have a different canner that uses a weighted gauge. But that information is highlighted, so I know what the right pressure is. Here are just a few of the resources, and I must mention the National Center for Home Food Preservation is the go-to information for home canning across the United States, and information is included in the book, so easy to preserve. And this is what Extension offices outreach across the US use as their primary resource. And then there's information from CDC about botulism, and the at CDC, they link also to the Land Grant University website directory. Through that, you can reach the extension websites of your state. And then just a couple of the other resources that I mentioned. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Bunning. Now I'd like to open it up for questions. It looks like we've gotten a few in the chat, so we will get started with those. I think the first one's probably for Robin. What was the pH of the homed canned pepper products?
Hi, Mike, thanks. We actually didn't have the testing of the pH of the home canned pepper products. When we sent those to CDC, they only tested for botulism and toxin type, to my knowledge, and so we don't have the answer to that. I'm sorry.
But I think you said that you thought it was the vinegar.
There was vinegar in the jars, but again, the assumption is that the acidity level was not sufficient to keep the growth of the toxin down.
Thanks. The next question is, can a pressure canner be used for all canning acidic and low acid foods? That might be for Dr. Bunning.
No, we'd recommend that the recommended equipment be used for that particular type of food, and the recipe, the tested recipes and the instructions have really been developed to maximize quality, also for to end up with a good product. So we wouldn't recommend that, no.
And I do believe that these slides will be available, as well as a copy of the recording. I believe we're hoping to put them in the registration page where we've got the information for the future ones as well. I have one other question for Dr. Bunning. So how do you know if a recipe's been tested?
Good question. So the check your resource. If that information comes from the National Center or it comes from a university, then it's been tested. So that's really, and there are some there can be some other resources, but the best thing to do is to check with your local extension office. They can be your guide for and you can share your recipe with them and where you found it, and then they can provide information about whether that is tested if you're not certain.
Awesome. And then I think there's another one for you on, does the pressure canner allow you to sterilize the two-piece lid to reuse?
No, it's not. It's the sterilization won't make the lid reusable. There's a sealant that is just one-time use. So that it isn't about being sterile, it's about having that sealant so that can form the proper seal. So nope, that won't work.
And you can't add glue or anything?
No, Ingrid,
Don't
I haven't had that question before, but no, it's not possible.
Thanks. We got some other ones. Do you think a damaged can, such as dropped or crushed, presents a greater risk for botulism or just contamination in general, since the seal may have been compromised?
Well, I'm guessing that's not a glass jar. They're talking about a can. So I'm going to pitch that to Robin or Nicole. What do you think?
I'm assuming that that is a commercial product.
A commercial.
Nicole, do you have specific information to answer that question with?
Yeah, I think, again, if you have a damaged can and low salt, low sugar, the right temperature, you had to have those like combination of factors, and there's there's spores in the food, then yeah, potentially that can, and you can maintain some level of anaerobic environment, that could be a risk. I would say here in Colorado, we've never, at least in the last 21 years, have not investigated a case of botulism associated with a dented can. I'm not I studied environmental health, but no longer, I don't work in environmental health, so I don't know. There might be some environmental health specialists that could better answer that, but it's not something that we routinely see, but the potential is there if all the other factors are present.
And Nicole, this one might be another good one for you. Do you have any guidance on how to collect foods to test during an outbreak investigation? How to choose which foods to test when a lot of risky foods were consumed?
Yeah, as you saw in our slides showing our cases over the past 21 years, we've seen an increase in foodborne cases over the last 2 years. Especially last fall, we had, in addition to the home canned green chili outbreak that Robin described, we've had a handful of other cases that we investigated. Generally, our approach has been to be pretty conservative when collecting food items. So anything that, if you are able to investigate the case, interview the case or someone in their family or next of kin, and get into the house, we usually collect as much as we can, at least foods that have any potential for potentially harboring the toxin. And then we work closely with CDC and look at the epi evidence and try to figure out when the person ate the food and how that aligns with the onset of symptoms. And in consultation with CDC, generally will determine which foods might be tested. So we have kind of taken the grab what you can that might even have even a small chance of being associated with the patient, and then from there work with CDC to kind of walk through the epi evidence and narrow down what foods might be good candidates for testing. As far as actually collecting the food, we generally will send our staff out with a cooler, and we try to collect food and keep it at the same temperature with which it was collected, unless it's something that that could spoil, then we'll keep that under refrigeration. I think the main key is try to get out there to collect the food as soon as you can, and because especially if it's a prepared food item, it may not last that long or may end up in the trash. We've had situations where we've had botulism cases associated with baked potatoes, where we've gone through trash and picked leftover potatoes wrapped in foil from the trash and have had those tested, and we're successful in finding toxin in those. So we really cast a wide net when we're doing that, but really work closely with CDC to figure out what's actually worth testing.
And then kind of switching gears a little bit, how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic and changing habits has impacted home canning? So this might be another question for Dr. Bunning.
Oh, I think it's had a big impact, and we're noticing still this year a surge in gardening. So I think people enjoyed it, so they're going to continue with that. And I mean, if you have a pretty good sized home garden, you're going to produce more food than you can consume, and so you want to preserve some of it. And for some folks, maybe that's that may be freezing, but others may want to home can. So and once they've tried it, and especially when you found certain products that you're really fond of, then you want to continue that. For me, it was pickled okra. When I lived in a state where I could grow okra, but once some people get hooked on it, so I think it's going to be, and once you've made the initial equipment and investment and the time to learn, then you want to continue it. So we think we'll see this trend increasing, or at least staying steady, if not increasing.
Thanks. Now I'm just going to kind of lump two. The first one is, how long does it take for the antitoxin to get to your facility from LAX quarantine station? And then I think maybe combined with that or similar is, are there any issues with chain of custody when collecting from a home or a commercial product?
So we were fortunate in Colorado. For years, we would work with the Los Angeles quarantine station to get antitoxin. Within the past couple of years, we became a storage site for botulism antitoxin as well as some malaria medication. So we do have a handful of doses on site now in Colorado, and that really makes sense if you look at our geography. We don't really have a quarantine station close to us, and in the winter months, it can be sometimes challenging to get antitoxin flown in. In fact, before we started housing doses here, we had a suspect case of botulism, and the toxin was flown in from Los Angeles quarantine station, but it was on the last plane that could leave LA because of a blizzard that was happening in Colorado. And it delayed, the plane made it, the antitoxin made it, we got to the hospital, but it was somewhat treacherous. So we're really grateful to CDC for allowing us to now store doses here. If you look at our average time between the decision of when antitoxin was needed and administering that antitoxin, having it on site here in Colorado has decreased that by 4 to 6 hours when I think last calculated it. So it is really beneficial to have that close. And of course, we are then able to get the toxin to our neighboring states, antitoxin to our neighboring states quickly as well if needed. And the other question, Ingrid, was?
Are there any issues with chain of custody when collecting from a home or a commercial product?
Yeah, we do. We have a lab collection form that we fill out a lab form for every food we collect. And in situations where we're collecting multiple foods, like maybe 20 or 30 items, it's a single lab form for each food item. At the bottom, we do have chain of custody. We haven't run into issues recently with, households releasing foods to us. It's gone pretty smoothly. And we haven't ran into any chain of custody issues either, but we do have documentation on our form to document when the food was collected, by whom it was collected, and then who it was dropped off to at our lab. We generally send foods to our state public health lab, who then will package and send them on to CDC if we decide that testing is warranted.
Thank you. I think the next set are for Dr. Bunning again. So do large containers, such as a 5-gallon container of gravy, create enough of an anaerobic environment to present a risk?
I'm not sure. That might be for Robin and Nicole.
Oh.
It's like a commercially produced product.
I'm not sure.
You can't home can 5 gallons.
That does make sense. If that person, or does Nicole or Robin have any thoughts on that, or do we need a little bit more information?
I think potentially, again, if the pH, sugar, salt content, temperature, anaerobic conditions all are present, it could be a risk. We have had a case here in Colorado a few years back that was associated with what we think was a homemade vegetable soup that was made on the stove and then held at room temperature with a lid for several days. And our best guess as to the cause of that person's botulism was probably that product. And it did contain root vegetables and other vegetables. And Dr. Bunning said too that vegetables are commonly, they're grown in soil. They likely have spores on them. So I would think gravy potentially could be a vehicle if all the conditions were present.
All right. Is it important to replace the fitting and the seal or the lid for home canning, or just the seal?
Yep, you can buy the lids separately, or they're sold separately, but you can reuse the screw bands as long as they're still in good shape.
Perfect. Is there a recommended time frame to eat home canned food when opened, and when is the shelf life? What is the shelf life once opened? Our
recommendation is to consume it within a year, because if you're preserving food, then logically you should have food available again, in the growing season, whatever it is for your state. So you could start that process again. So ideally within a year, the quality, and to maintain the quality too. So.
All right, next one. What factors can lead to botulism growth for fermented food? Since fermented food should increase in acidity while fermenting, what could go wrong?
Well, I'll just first mention that if you look at CDC surveillance information, botulism has been associated with fermented foods many, many times. And because the conditions are right, obviously the pH isn't enough of a hurdle. And I'll pass that, probably Robin and Nicole have some experience with that.
We don't think we've had a case of botulism, at least in the ones I participated in that's been associated with fermented food. We had a confirmed case this past fall that we think may have been, but it was a patient who lived alone, and we were never able to get into their living space to determine what they use. But yeah, I don't have much information or knowledge about risk of fermented foods and steps to take there.
I think a big one with that is in Alaska among traditional food preparation, fermentation gone wrong. But we might have someone speak about that on our last webinar series, hopefully, to be continued. So then we've got another one on, do you recommend not purchasing dented cans of food? Does it matter how dented they are or where the dent is located?
We get this question occasionally here, and really our department's stance is to just avoid purchasing dented cans or consuming them. I serve as our after call epi sometimes, and got a call recently from someone who purchased a dented can, opened it, it smelled bad. They wondered how it tasted, and they tasted it. And fortunately, they said it was gross. And then they started doing research, and they, Googled botulism, and then we're really worried. Fortunately, this person didn't go on to develop botulism, but we always take the better safe than sorry approach when it comes to dented cans, as they have been implicated in botulism cases in the past.
Thanks. With the increase in popularity with pressure cookers, has there been any additional outreach with education in the difference between pressure cookers and pressure canners? I think this probably can tie into like the Instapot popularity too.
There are resources available for information for using the multi-cookers, and information has been available through, from different states, information for pressure cooking foods, as well as for canning using pressure canners. So no, information is available.
And we might have time for one or two more. So do we have any updates regarding the availability of supplies right now due to the pandemic? And do you think botulism cases are expected to rise in the fall season during major holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's? Any thoughts on that?
Well, on the supply front, we're guessing that manufacturers are going to rise to the occasion when supplies were, there was a shortage last year, and people were desperate for them. So we're expecting the supply chain to have built up since last year, but we really don't have access to that information, so I don't know. And on the second part of the question, I'd pass to Robin and Nicole.
Sorry, what was the second part, Ingrid?
Whether the holidays.
Are we expecting an uptick in botulism cases at the end of the year with the holidays and everybody canning?
We haven't seen that in our surveillance data. I mean, the uptick we saw started occurring last August, September, and kind of through the winter months. I think some of our uptake was also just when we had a couple of cases reported, we pushed out a health alert to all of our physicians in the state and focused on the reaching the neurologists as well. And sometimes when because botulism is where many healthcare providers haven't ever seen a case, when you get it kind of on their radar, they might be more likely to recognize potential cases or suspect cases. So I don't think we have any evidence to think that we'll see an increase, but we are still kind of pondering why we saw this increase during the latter part of last year and how that might relate to the pandemic and just social distancing and lack of movement really in our communities.
So I think we're at time. Apologies to those of you who had a question that we didn't get to. The infant one hopefully will be answered next time. I would just like to thank our speakers again for taking time today and sharing their great presentations. There will be a short evaluation that we're going to send out and would really appreciate you all completing to help us improve the future sessions. I think the link might be in the chat. Next month, we are hoping to have staff with the Infant Botulism Treatment and Prevention Program at the California Department of Public Health talk about infant botulism. And we'll be sending out email announcements for each of the webinars about a month before their date, and registration information will be coming soon for the remainder of the series. Thank you all for attending today.